On this edition of FedGov Today with Francis Rose, sponsored by Maximus, one Pentagon data problem is showing up on installations around the world.
A lot of the decisions about facilities are made at the installation level, which makes sense, right? The installation commander has purview over the installation, but the services don't have a view of what's going on across their installations.
Alissa of the Government Accountability Office on FedGov Today in just a moment. Uniting program strategy, advanced technology, process, and execution for a more efficient government. That's Maximus. Every program, every service, every time. That's innovation forward. Learn more at maximus.com/federal. The Defense Department has a data problem that's costing it both money and capacity. Alissa is Director of Defense Capabilities and Management at the Government Accountability Office. Alissa, welcome. It's great to talk to you again. Thanks for coming back on the show. I note in your most recent work, the Pentagon's portfolio, real estate portfolio, includes more than 700,000 facilities with a value of about $2.2 trillion. What is going on in the Pentagon or more broadly across the government that has created this high-risk list area managing federal real property? Welcome, Alissa.
Thanks for having me, Francis. Yes, managing real property in the federal government has been on GAO's high-risk list for over 20 years. So this is an issue across the federal government of effectively utilizing space and making sure that spaces that are owned and leased are kept up to date. Particularly for DoD, we've had a body of work over many, many years, kind of following the challenges DoD has faced, particularly with not fully funding sustainment for its facilities. They typically fund only 80% of their needs. They have a huge backlog in deferred maintenance and a real backlog, as we point out in this report, in property that is really on the list for demolition, but they don't have the funds to demolish it. So they are maintaining it and spending money maintaining facilities that they don't actually need.
You write in this work, DoD provides guidance to its components to ensure consistency of utilization measurement and reporting across the department, but they're not using that. The services are not using that guidance. What's the gap between the guidance that the DoD provides and the services declining for whatever reason to use that?
Yes, DoD put out a policy about 9 years ago now, kind of trying to standardize across the services how to measure utilization. So it's a pretty simple formula that DoD gave all the military services to use. Each of the services are still doing their own thing. So the Air Force is actually the only one that adopted DoD's methodology. They didn't adopt it until a couple years ago, so their data prior to, I think, 2020 is outdated. Some of the other services just do their own thing. The Army, for example, just assigns a 0 or a 100 to each of its properties. So 0 meaning it's not being used, 100 meaning it's used. So they can't really tell how occupied that space is, if it's like an office building, for example. The Navy and the Marine Corps do their own thing too. So they do an average of occupancy across their property too. So DoD's not getting a holistic picture across the services, even though it has guidance for the services to use a certain methodology. So we made a recommendation in this report that DoD needs to take steps to hold the services accountable for following that guidance, because without that, really don't know what the picture of property utilization really looks like.
Did the Army, Navy, Marine Corps give a reason why they don't follow that guidance?
Yes, they each have their own systems. They acknowledged and readily told us that they believe their information is inaccurate, but they have their own processes, and they just hadn't updated their processes or systems to follow the DoD guidance.
Now, one thing you do note, the Army's piloting a tool to improve visibility of space utilization, but I noted this phrase that may be significant and may not be, in properties measured by square footage. Does that phrase make a difference in the way the Army's measure things? Because I always assumed all real property was measured in square footage for one reason or another.
Right. I mean, we actually see that as a positive development for the Army to take steps in doing that. But some of the other services really do a manual process. They have spreadsheets or other kind of ways that they're they're measuring their rates and using different tools, and it really varies by installation too. So we did highlight that as an example we thought was positive for the Army, but still inconsistency across the services.
I want to go back to that idea that you talked about earlier in our conversation, Alissa, and that is that the organizations are not able to knock down, get rid of buildings that they want to, and so they're paying essentially by the year to maintain them because they can't get one big budget influx to be able to get rid of these buildings. Is there any measurement as to how much the life cycle costs of these buildings that the services would like to demolish are, as opposed to the one-time appropriation they would need in order to get rid of them?
Yeah, I mean, having good data is part of the message of our report. Really understanding what their real property portfolios look like is a key step. The Navy, for example, I think quoted us a figure of $700 million in a backlog of demolition projects. So they want to get rid of at least $700 million, and they can't do that. Some of them have been on lists for 5, 7, 8 years, and they can't get them demoed, and they're having to put money into those facilities, or they're waiting for a new project to be funded before they can get rid of the old one. We have an example in the report of a hospital waiting to be built, but there were design challenges with the hospital. So the old hospital was being maintained even though they really couldn't use it even. Or some facilities were sharing utilities with other facilities that are not actually using the building, but they've got shared utilities, so they can't demo the building. There's kind of a variety of challenges. One of the interesting ones, too, is there are several buildings on DoD properties that are deemed historic. So they have to maintain those facilities. Some of those have kind of frequent damage related to weather. There was one that's flooding constantly. They're not using the facility, but they have to keep pouring money into it to keep it updated because it's historic and they have to preserve it.
You've got a photo of one of those buildings, one in Fort Bliss, Texas, in your work here, and I'm just going by the appearance of the photograph. The building doesn't look like it's in great shape, and I wonder at what point, I know this is not necessarily a question for you, it's probably a question for somebody in historic preservation, but at what point does the condition overcome the historic significance of a building that, I'm just looking at this picture, doesn't appear to be something significant? It doesn't look, it's rather nondescript, with no offense intended to the people at Fort Bliss.
Right. I mean, it is an important issue to look at because there are additional requirements for historic buildings. We have a number of examples in the report. One had hurricane damage. They had to replace the roof of the building, even though it wasn't being used, but it was a historic building. So they had to invest all of that money. Meanwhile, they have all of these backlogs and they could have used those funds elsewhere.
You mentioned one of your recommendations. You've got 5 here. Another one that you're making regards another type of guidance in assessing risk management. Tell me what that means and how that would help the Pentagon, either with capacity, budget, or both.
Right. So a lot of the decisions about facilities are made at the installation level, which makes sense, right? The installation commander has a purview over the installation, but the services don't have a view of what's going on across their installations. So there's no guidance requiring the services to get that information across their installations so they can take a wider view of things and manage risks, right? So those were our other recommendations to each of the services to develop guidance to make sure they're assessing and managing some of these risks that we were talking about today.
What's the way that you will measure whether the departments are following up on this in the way that you would like? Is it as simple as DoD puts out guidance and the services follow them, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, we're following this issue through a variety of things. I mean, we're encouraged that DoD concurred with all of the recommendations, so that's great. A first step, right, is holding the services accountable for standard utilization rates. So we'll go back and check if the services have changed their methodology to make sure that they're following that DoD guidance. That's a fairly, easy thing to assess. We will look at the guidance that the services develop to look across their installations too, but we are always on the ground at installations. We have a review right now looking at deferred maintenance, looking at security issues, looking at housing conditions. So we're constantly looking at installations and talking to folks on the ground and using these facilities to see if there is a difference being made there.
Alissa, it's great to have you back on the program. Thanks for joining me today. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Francis.
You can find a link to Alissa's work on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. The Coast Guard has a $13 billion budget balance to strike this fiscal year between capitalization and modernization. You'll learn how the service is striking that balance from Coast Guard Chief Financial Officer Rear Admiral Matt Lake. He'll be on FedGov Today TV this Sunday morning at 10:30 on ABC7 in Washington and on the FedGov Today YouTube channel. If you miss the debut of the show, you can watch it on demand anytime at fedgovtoday.com and on YouTube. Data practitioners are just scratching the surface of what they can do, according to one government data expert. Shmendra Paul, a veteran of VA, DHS, the Energy Department, and more, is on the next FedGov Today podcast. You can listen to every FedGov Today podcast anytime you want on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or on demand at fedgovtoday.com. I'm Francis Rose. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.